All right, here's Yves-François Blanchet.
Oui.
Et une question en français, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, Monsieur Blanchet.
Hello, Mr.
Hilario, Radio
Blanchet.
CKUT Montréal. À l'extérieur du débat
Now,
aujourd'hui, le Front
outside
d'Action
the
populaire
debate,
en
the
réaménagement
Front
urbain
d'Action
demande au
Populaire
parti de prendre
is
un
asking the
engagement
party
concret
to
face à la
make a
crise du logement,
concrete
notamment en
commitment
construisant
to
plus de
housing
500 000 nouveaux logements au
by
Canada, pour 100 000 au
building
Québec au cours des
500,000
10
new
prochaines années.
homes over the next
Pouvez-vous nous
10
donner un
years.
chiffre aujourd'hui sur
Can
le
you
nombre
give
de
us a
logements
figure
sociaux que votre
today
parti
on the
s'engage à
number of
construire?
social housing units
Pour
that
être
your
proportionnel,
party
ça serait un peu plus que
would
100 000 au Québec.
build? Well, it would be
Je
more
ne
than
m'engage pas à
100,000 in
construire des
Quebec,
logements
but
sociaux
I
parce que,
cannot commit to build
dans ma
housing in
liste d'ambition, il n'y a
Quebec
pas de devenir premier ministre
because
du Canada.
I am not intending to become
Par
Prime
contre,
Minister of Canada.
je pense qu'on doit
However,
construire
I do
beaucoup de
think we
logements, qu'on
must
est dans
build
les
a lot of
centaines de milliers.
housing,
Mais le
hundreds
logement
of
social,
thousands
c'est
of
une
units.
catégorie. Moi, je parle du logement
But
étudiant parce
I'm
que c'est le
talking
moins
about
cher au
student
prix carré
housing
par nombre de
because
personnes
it
que tu loges.
is
Tu baisses la
the
pression, tu dégages de l'espace pour les budgets pour le logement
type of
social.
housing where you
Tu
can
peux avoir
house the
recours
most
au logement
people.
abordable, mais
You
à mon
can
avis,
use
c'est pas la
affordable
meilleure formule
housing, but that's
parce que
not
tu
the best formula, in
finances
my
la valeur
opinion,
des
because
propriétés
you're
privées. Et après ça,
funding
tu baisses la
or
pression sur le
raising
parc
the
résidentiel
value of private
pour contenir la
investments.
spéculation. Les prix des
Now,
gens
the
descendront
idea
pas,
is
mais au moins
to
tu
counter
ralentis ça.
speculation,
Et après,
and
il
you
faut
can
aider les gens à
reduce
devenir
that.
acquéreurs. Mais le logement qui
But
n'est pas
housing
à propriété
that
pour
is
exploitation
not
commerciale, c'est la base par
commercial
laquelle on peut
housing
baisser
is
la
the
pression sur le
basis
parc
through which
résidentiel.
you can
Par le passé, le gouvernement
act.
fédéral a
Now, the
participé
federal
activement à la
government
construction de logements
has
sociaux.
been
Dans les
actively
années 90,
involved in
augmentons la
building
proportion du
social
logement social au
housing,
Québec à 10%
but
du marché locatif. En ce moment, à Montréal,
right
on est
now
à
in
5% de
Montreal,
logements sociaux.
there is only
Je me demandais
5% social
même
housing.
si, votre
So
parti va pas
I'm
être chef
wondering
du
whether,
gouvernement au fédéral,
even
comment est-ce
if
que vous allez
your
engager le
party could
fédéral
not
à investir des
run
fonds
the
dans le
government,
logement social?
how would your
On lui
party
demandant de
invest
respecter
in
la
social
juridiction du
housing?
Québec.
Well, first
Et
of all,
j'encourage tout le
Quebec's
monde à
jurisdiction must be
reconnaître le fait
respected, and I
que
think
c'est
it's
les
important for
paliers
everyone to
municipaux qui le
respect
mieux
the
équipés
fact
pour
that
connaître
the
les
municipal
besoins,
level is
la
the best,
possibilité, la
in the best
capacité
position to understand what the
urbain
needs are
pour choisir
and
un
to
maximum
choose
d'endroits propices
the
à la construction
locations
de logements sociaux
where
ou
social
étudiants
or
pour faire ce
student
travail à
housing
partir
should
de la
be
base.
built.
Mais la multiplication des paliers
But,
qui, au bénéfice
you
du
know,
équilibre
when there are a
fiscal
number
interne
of
des
little
compétences du Québec,
different levels of
c'est pas
government
mon
that are
idée.
involved, that is not
Question, English,
necessarily
please.
the best
Mr. Blanchet,
system.
Good evening. David Menzies with Rebel News. Ms. Blanchet, since 1941, a pipeline has brought oil from Portland, Maine to Montreal. Over the years, it has brought hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, much of it from OPEC dictatorships. Why have you never, not even once, opposed OPEC conflict oil being imported through an aging pipeline? Why do you prefer OPEC conflict oil over Alberta ethical oil?
I seem to believe that you already have the answer you want to write, so your question seems to contain the answer. I believe I am the one who authorized the change of direction in Enbridge Line B in 2013, which seems to prove that I'm not a fanatic against oil. But I believe that we've got to reduce our consumption of oil progressively, including from Alberta, because we are clearly being very expensive for every family in Quebec and Canada and destroying the whole planet. The denial of the reality of climate change since the beginning of this campaign and the change of heart of Mr. Carney, who decided to be more conservative than Mr. Poiliev, is very harmful for environment.
Mr. Blanchet, just to follow up on that question, your party and your stance on pipelines would seem to be diametrically opposed to Quebecers. A poll came out showing that 74% of Quebecers support the building of new pipelines. Why are you and your party not in sync with the majority of people in this province, sir?
Don't you know my love for commenting polls? Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Question en français, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bonjour, M. Blanchet.
Hello,
Il est
Mr.
Quentin Nantais,
Blanchet.
The Hub. Depuis le
The
7
Hub.
octobre 2023,
Since
la communauté
October
juive fait face à une
7th,
vague
the
alarmante
community,
de terreur
the Jewish
contre
community has been
Israël.
facing a
On compte
wave of attacks against it.
6219 attaques
There have been over 6,000 anti-Semitic events in 2024, fire bombings, attacks against schools. Pierre Poilievre has said that any person, any foreign visitor should be deported if involved in this kind of event. Do you believe that a permanent resident should have the right to stay in Canada? Anyone who is in Canada must abide by Canadian laws. But as I said, we're in a very difficult situation right now. In Quebec and in Canada, the Jewish community has been the subject of violence from Islamist radical organizations, whereas in Gaza, it's the Palestinian people, excluding Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that should be eradicated. The Palestinian people are subject to that violence. So the only real solution is a two-state solution through which, and this is the position that should be considered in terms of creating a Palestinian state. A number of Albertans are frustrated with the federal government and feel that Canada no longer works for them because they feel it's harming their prosperity. As leader of the Bloc, what do you think of the idea of Western sovereignty? I cannot comment on the desire of Albertans to be sovereign or not. A nation defines itself and would consequently have the right to self-determination. But the desire to fully develop oil reserves is the right of a province or a state.
Be better off fighting Trump alone?
I don't believe that anybody can be better off fighting Trump alone. I believe that we have to build alliance between equals. It means Canada and Mexico and European countries and Asian countries and Quebec. Canada does not have to be a province of Mexico to ally with Mexico against Trump. Quebec would not have to be a province of Canada to ally with Canada and Mexico against Trump. It won't happen in the coming months, of course, but the idea is for an economy. Quebec economy is different from Canadian economy, and it has to be treated accordingly. So far, all we have seen is efforts being deployed in order to protect Ontario economy, which is the way Canada defines itself. And nothing has been done when, let's say, lumberwood industry in Quebec has paid $2 billion in tariffs, specific kind of tariffs, which name in English I don't know, to the Americans. And it is to the industry, car industry, that Mr. Carney said that he would give $2 billion, nothing in Quebec. He even said that he had got $30 billion of tariffs, counter tariffs, about aluminum. Nobody seems to know about that. Where does that come from, and where did the money go? There seems to be no such thing. The problem is that when Quebec aluminum goes to the United States and is transformed in the United States and comes back in Quebec with tariffs, we pay to use our own aluminum and inflict inflation on our own people. This is not the right way to manage the aluminum situation.
We've got less than 2 weeks left of this campaign. How are you going to convince Bloc voters who are considering voting Liberal to come back to you instead?
Exactly like I did tonight.
And what do you think was most convincing tonight?
I hope as much of it as possible was convincing. I'm not the one to decide about that. It belongs to the population of Quebec.
Une question courte, rapide en français, s'il vous plaît.
Le mot de la fin. Bonsoir, M. Blanchet, Simon Filiatro, Espace Autochtone à Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada.
Je pense pas que je vais vous prendre par surprise en vous
I
annonçant
don't think
que
I'll
les questions autochtones ont
surprise
été
you
très
when
peu
I say
abordées
that the
pendant le
Indigenous
débat.
issues were
Alors,
not
je
really
vous
addressed
demande,
in the
quelle est la
debate.
place des questions
So
autochtones
I'd
dans
like
votre
to know
programme,
what
comment
the
prévoyez-vous de faire
place
valoir vos
of
intérêts
Indigenous
que
issues
parfois semblent
is in
diverger
your
de ceux du peuple québécois?
platform. Well, first of all, a couple of principles. I had noticed that the Indigenous issue had been completely set aside when we were talking about culture. And I thought to myself, how is it that in the context of negotiating with the United States, and the 13 provinces and territories in Quebec. Well, we have our own economy because, unlike what Mr. Carney has said, there are 13 economies, not one. But the indigenous nations are where around the table? These are full-fledged nations with the right to self-determination, and they could play a very worthwhile role in the negotiation. But that was not discussed at all, such as environmental issues. It was swept under the carpet, and you granolas, you're not going to bug us with the environment. We need oil for Canada's sovereignty, whereas the Americans consider Canadian oil is already their property, and they don't feel guilty about that at all. And another thing that people don't take into consideration, including when it comes to energy, is the transmission of energy and also the green energy in Quebec. We could have a north-south axis for that, but they're focused on the east-west axis. And, they can engage in all the polling that they want. I put Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney in the same bag. They'll be talking about Energy East and pipelines because there are people who are pretty much asleep on the environmental issue, but in Quebec, that's not the case.
Merci.
On se voit demain.
Merci.
See you tomorrow.
Okay, hands in pockets. There he goes. Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, the last one at the podium. There were only 4. There were supposed to be 5, but of course the Green Party was disqualified from the debates. But before we talk about the debates and the totality, any thoughts about Yves-François Blanchet?
Yeah, I mean, this was supposed to be a big moment for him. In the past 2 debates, he's managed to do some damage, and polls have increased anywhere from 5 to 7% after those debates. I'm not sure that was the case tonight. And again, that is really because the context is everything in this election. I do think we should maybe spend a bit of time talking about the pipeline issue because it was, I thought, one of the stronger sections of the debate. It was one where you saw a stark contrast between where people sit on it, and it is, as Mr. Blanchet points out there, an issue of deep sensitivity to Quebecers. The idea that the pipeline would run through Quebec as the previous Energy East pipeline was going to do. There has been a little bit of movement in the polls in terms of Quebec's support around that. Certainly the Premier has expressed a little more interest in it. But I think, Pierre Poilievre was asked numerous times, would you allow a pipeline to go ahead without provincial consent and without Indigenous consent? And his answer was sort of, well, as long as generally everybody agrees, then I would be fine. Mark Carney was not quite that broad. He does want to see big energy projects, maybe a pipeline, maybe something else, but he also wants to make sure that people are consulted. What they both have in common, though, is that they both want some version of one project, one review, which would mean that everyone would agree on the nature of the review that would happen and the project would start. And I think that's where, Alberta and provinces out west are very interested in seeing things move much more quickly, and where provinces like Quebec and others, where they would just see something run through it, are a little more skeptical about how this would work in practice.
I can tell you just from some of the conversations I've had across the country in the last little while, people are very confused about where the leaders stand on pipelines. Right. They're very confused, and they're confused about refining oil. They're confused about what can go where. I mean, Blanchet just talked about consulting the Indigenous communities. That has not come up a lot in this debate tonight. I mean, I think the pipeline it means a lot of different things to different people.
Right. I mean, broadly, just look, Blanchet basically against them, right? The NDP broadly against them. Pierre Poilievre broadly in favor. The issue that not an issue, the answer he gave tonight that could be a challenge for him in other parts of the country, because there's not a lot of real growth for him in Quebec, is that, he talked about a pipeline, that went along where there's a series of First Nations and Indigenous groups. He said about 80% were in favor, 20% were opposed, and in his view, in that case, majority rules. So that implies a willingness to impose a pipeline over some objections. That is going to be politically sensitive in certain parts of British Columbia, but that's also going to be politically popular in certain parts of British Columbia. What Mark Carney has talked about, and what Mr. Blanchet tried to squeeze him on there in the one part of the debate was he talked about using the extraordinary powers of the federal government to make these big projects move along. Now, we saw a version of that with the TMX pipeline dispute between British Columbia and Alberta, where the John Horgan government was sort of getting in the way of a project that was legally and constitutionally allowed. So the federal government acquired it and turned it into a national project, which allowed them to override the province's objections to do it. When Mark Carney gave that first answer, he did it in French and in English and didn't quite explain it the way he is saying it now, that he is not imposing. What he's talking about doing is using the extreme powers the federal government has to expedite approval and review process. So while he's not repealing Bill C-69, which the Conservatives refer to as the No New Pipeline Act, he's talking about using a component of it called the substitution policy, which basically you can let the province do the environmental review and the Indigenous review. You backstop them with money and expertise to bring it up to a consistent standard so you can have one project, one review, and have it done fast. So he's talking about using the extraordinary powers of the federal government to move things along faster. He is not talking about using it to force it on an Indigenous group or a province that does not want it. But you at least get it to that decision point as quickly as possible to remove the uncertainty, remove the delays, and let the company or the proponent or whatever who's behind it make a decision faster. There's still skepticism on this because there are still members of his cabinet like Stephen Guilbeault and others that people in the energy sector say, yeah, Mark Carney may look at it differently, but does the rest of the Liberal team look at it differently? That's something they'll have to overcome.
Just a quick point is that the Liberals, again, are maintaining the cap on industrial polluters. They have removed it on consumers, on the consumer carbon tax. They killed that. But Pierre Poilievre has removed it entirely.
This is the price, not the cap, the price.
The price, sorry, the price. Yeah. So we don't really know how that would work for Pierre Poilievre. That's the piece that he hasn't cleared up.
Okay.